The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Starbucks on Carson Boulevard, casting golden rectangles across the polished concrete floor. It was one of those perfect Southern California days where the temperature hovered at 72 degrees and the sky stretched endlessly blue. Inside, the coffee shop hummed with its usual rhythm, the hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from a corner table. Chen stood in line, her canvas messenger bag slung over one shoulder, trying to decide between her usual vanilla latte and something more adventurous. She'd only been in town for 3 weeks, having just transferred to UCLA for her junior year, and she was still learning the rhythms of this new city, this new life. Everything felt both exciting and slightly off-kilter, like she was constantly walking on a ship's deck that swayed just enough to keep her unsteady. She wore a light long-sleeved shirt despite the warmth, a habit she developed over the past 2 years. The fabric was soft cotton, breathable enough for the California heat, but substantial enough to serve its purpose. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried herself with a certain careful grace, the kind that came from being perpetually aware of her body in space. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 young men entered the coffee shop just as Sarah reached the counter to place her order. They were clearly college students, probably sophomores, Sarah guessed, wearing Greek letters and that particular brand of confidence that came from never having been genuinely challenged. The tallest one, a blond guy with a backwards baseball cap, was talking loudly about some party from the previous weekend. "Tall vanilla latte, please," Sarah said to the barista, a woman with kind eyes and purple streaks in her hair. "And could I get that with oat milk?" As she moved to the pickup area, Sarah became aware of the 3 guys settling at a table near the window. They were the kind of group that took up more space than they needed, chairs pushed back, bags tossed carelessly, voices projecting across the room as if they were the only people present. The barista called out her name, Sarah. And she stepped forward to collect her drink. It was in that moment, as she reached for the cup, that her sleeve rode up slightly. Just a few inches, but enough. Enough to reveal the edge of scarring that traced up her forearm, the kind of texture that told a story skin wasn't meant to tell. "Dude, did you see that?" one of the guys said, not even bothering to lower his voice. It was the blonde one, the apparent ringleader. What the hell happened to her arm? Sarah's fingers tightened around the cup. She'd been through this before, of course. The stares, the whispers, the carefully averted eyes, or worse, the aggressive curiosity. She developed thick skin about it, or at least she told herself she had. But something about the casual cruelty in the guy's tone, the entertainment value he seemed to derive from her scars, made her jaw clench. "Maybe she got attacked by a lawnmower," another one chimed in, and they erupted in laughter. "Or like, fell into a wood chipper or something." The third guy, slightly quieter than his friends but clearly not wanting to be left out, added, "Bro, maybe she's one of those cutters. You know, the emo kids who..." "Excuse me?" The barista's voice cut through their laughter like a knife. She was glaring at the 3 guys with an expression that could have frozen lava. "That's completely inappropriate. If you can't behave like decent human beings, you can leave." The blond guy held up his hands in mock surrender. "Whoa, chill. We're just talking. Free country, right?" Sarah stood frozen at the pickup counter, her latte growing warm in her hands. Part of her wanted to flee, to grab her bag and disappear into the afternoon crowd, to find another coffee shop, another campus hangout, somewhere she could exist without becoming a spectacle. But another part of her, the part that had carried her through months of recovery and rehabilitation, refused to give these entitled jerks the satisfaction of driving her away. She turned to face them, her expression carefully neutral. "Actually," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "I was in an accident. But I appreciate your concern." The sarcasm in that last word was sharp enough to cut glass. The blond guy's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it widened. "An accident? What kind of accident leaves you looking like?" "Like I survived something you couldn't imagine," Sarah interrupted, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. Something that required more courage in a single moment than you've probably shown in your entire life. The coffee shop had gone noticeably quieter. Other customers were watching now, some with phones subtly raised, others simply frozen with their drinks halfway to their lips. The barista stood with her arms crossed, clearly ready to intervene again if necessary. One of the other guys, sensing perhaps that they'd crossed a line, tugged at his friend's sleeve. "Dude, come on. Let's just..." But the blonde wasn't ready to back down. His face had flushed slightly, whether from embarrassment or anger, Sarah couldn't tell. "Oh, so now you're some kind of hero? Because you got hurt? That doesn't..." Sarah set her latte down on the nearest table with deliberate care. Then, with movements that were both graceful and purposeful, she reached for the hem of her long-sleeved shirt and began to roll up her sleeve. The scarring became fully visible as Sarah rolled up her sleeve, a complex pattern of healed burns and grafted skin that extended from her wrist to well past her elbow. The tissue was a patchwork of colors, from pale pink to deeper rose, with the telltale texture of skin that had been reconstructed by surgical teams working miracle after miracle. But it wasn't the scars that made the three guys' expressions shift from smug superiority to something more uncertain. It was the tattoo. Positioned carefully along the inside of her forearm, incorporated into the landscape of her scarring with remarkable artistry, was a detailed military insignia. The tattoo was relatively new, the ink still vibrant, but it had clearly been designed specifically to work with her scars, not hide them. It featured the distinctive wings and propeller of Army aviation, rendered in sharp black lines with subtle shading that gave it depth and dimension. But it was the text beneath the insignia that made the blonde guy's face go pale. CW2 Sarah Chen, 160th SOAR. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers. Sarah watched as recognition slowly dawned across their faces. Even these privileged college kids, who probably couldn't name half the branches of the military, knew what SOAR meant. The 160th was legendary, the elite helicopter unit that flew the most dangerous missions in the darkest hours, the pilots who inserted and extracted special forces operators in hostile territory, the aviators who'd been part of every major operation from Mogadishu to Abbottabad. "You're..." The blonde guy started, but his voice trailed off. "A chief warrant officer too," Sarah finished for him, her voice still level. "Was, technically. Medical retirement after my Black Hawk was hit during an extraction mission in Afghanistan. We were pulling out a SEAL team that had gotten pinned down in a valley. The RPG came through the cockpit." She gestured to her arm, then touched her shoulder, her neck. "Shrapnel and fire. My co-pilot didn't make it. I somehow did." The coffee shop was completely silent now. Even the espresso machine seemed to have paused in deference to her words. Sarah continued, rolling her sleeve up further to reveal more of the scarring, more of the story written on her skin. "I was 26 years old. I'd been flying for Army aviation for 5 years, with the 160th for 2. That night was supposed to be routine, if you can call anything routine when you're flying into a hot zone in the middle of the night with enemy forces shooting at you from 3 directions. One of the other guys, the one who'd made the wood chipper comment, had gone completely white. We didn't." "You didn't know," Sarah said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, only weariness. "No, you didn't. But you also didn't think to consider that maybe, just maybe, someone's scars might represent something other than a source of entertainment for you. That maybe there's a human being with a story standing in front of you, not just a spectacle to mock." She rolled her sleeve back down, smoothing the fabric with careful fingers. The gesture was practiced, automatic, something she'd done hundreds of times since leaving Walter Reed Medical Center, where she'd spent 8 months learning to use her rebuilt arm, learning to live in a body that had been fundamentally changed. The blonde guy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? We were being stupid. I'm sorry." Sarah studied him for a long moment. His apology sounded genuine, his earlier bravado completely deflated. but she could also see that he was sorry primarily because he'd been caught mocking a veteran, someone whose sacrifice he'd been taught to respect in the abstract if not always in practice. She wondered if he'd have been equally apologetic had she been a civilian, had her scars come from a car accident or a medical condition. "Yeah," she said finally. "You were being stupid. The question is, what are you going to do differently next time you see someone who looks different from you? Someone whose body tells a story you don't immediately understand." The guy nodded, his jaw tight. I'll think before I speak." "That would be a good start," Sarah agreed. The barista appeared at Sarah's elbow, pressing a pastry bag into her hand. "This one's on the house," she said quietly. "Thank you for your service. And I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Sarah accepted the bag with a small smile. "Thank you. And you didn't have to." "I wanted to," the barista insisted. She glanced at the three guys, who were now gathering their things in uncomfortable silence. "And you three? You're banned for a week. Maybe use that time to think about basic human decency." As the guys filed out, the blonde one paused at the door. He turned back to Sarah, and she could see genuine shame in his expression now, not just embarrassment at being called out. "I really am sorry," he said. "My uncle was in the Marines. He would have kicked my ass if he'd heard me talk like that." Sarah nodded once, accepting the apology without absolving him of the behavior. Some lessons needed to sting to stick. When they were gone, the normal sounds of the coffee shop gradually resumed. People returned to their conversations, their laptops, their drinks. But Sarah noticed the glances now, no longer curious or judgmental, but respectful. An older man in a Vietnam veteran's cap raised his coffee cup to her in silent salute. A young woman with a toddler mouthed "thank you" across the room. Sarah collected her latte and her pastry and found a quiet corner table. She pulled out her laptop, intending to work on her political science assignment, but found herself staring at the screen without really seeing it. The encounter at Starbucks stayed with Sarah long after she'd left the coffee shop. She found herself back in her small studio apartment near campus, her political science textbook open on her desk, but her mind was elsewhere, circling back to the confrontation, examining it from different angles like she was debriefing a mission. This wasn't the first time since her injury that she'd faced mockery or cruel curiosity. There had been the woman at the grocery store who'd loudly asked if she was contagious. The teenager at the beach who'd taken a photo without permission, probably to post with some mocking caption on social media. The well-meaning but ultimately invasive strangers who demanded to know her story as if her trauma was public property, as if surviving something terrible gave everyone else the right to the details. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was because these were college students, people her own age, people who should have known better. Or maybe it was because she'd finally reached a point in her recovery where she could stand up for herself without the weight of fresh trauma pulling her under. Sarah touched the tattoo through her sleeve, feeling the slightly raised texture of the ink on scar tissue. She'd gotten it 6 months ago, after her final reconstructive surgery, after the doctors had told her that this was as good as it was going to get. The tattoo artist had been a veteran himself, Army, Iraq War, and he'd understood exactly what she wanted, not to hide the scars, but to incorporate them into something meaningful, to reclaim the narrative of her own body. "Your scars tell a story," he'd said, sketching the design on transfer paper. "A story of service, of survival, of strength. Why should you hide that?" Why indeed? Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate from freshman year, Maya, who'd stayed at their original college back in Colorado. The text contained a link to a video with the message, "OMG, is this you?" Sarah clicked the link and found herself watching phone footage from the Starbucks. Someone had recorded the encounter, not the initial mockery, unfortunately, but her response, the reveal of her tattoo, her quiet but powerful explanation of how she'd been injured. The video had been posted to TikTok an hour ago and already had over 50,000 views. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. The way those guys' faces changed when they saw that tattoo skull. Imagine mocking a Night Stalker pilot and thinking you're cool. This woman is a hero and those boys are trash. Thank you for your service, ma'am, United States. But there were other comments too, the kind that made Sarah's chest tighten. Why does she have to make everything about the military though? Probably lying for attention. Women can't be pilots in combat zones. This one particularly annoyed Sarah, given that the combat exclusion policy had been lifted over a decade ago. If you sign up for the military, you know what you're getting into. Don't expect special treatment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah closed the video and set her phone face down on her desk. She didn't need this, didn't need to become some viral moment, some inspiration porn for strangers on the internet. She'd enrolled at UCLA to finish her degree in political science, to build a new life, to figure out who Sarah Chen was when she wasn't CW2 Chen, when she wasn't a pilot, when she wasn't defined by one terrible night in the Hindu Kush. But apparently, that night was going to follow her whether she wanted it to or not. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline in the distance. The city sprawled endlessly in all directions, a sea of possibility and anonymity, and yet somehow, even here, she couldn't escape her past. Her mind drifted back to that night, the mission that had changed everything. They'd gotten the call at 0200 hours, a SEAL team had encountered unexpected resistance and needed emergency extraction. Sarah and her co-pilot, CW3 Marcus Rodriguez, had spooled up their Black Hawk within minutes. Marcus had been a mentor to her, a pilot with over 15 years of experience, a man who'd flown missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen other places that officially didn't exist. Just another day at the office, Chen, he joked as they lifted off into the darkness, their Black Hawk one of two heading to the extraction point. In and out, 20 minutes tops. It had been 12 minutes when the RPG hit. Sarah remembered the way the world had turned to fire and noise and pain. She remembered Marcus's voice on the comms, calm even as the helicopter spun out of control. "We're going down, stay with me, Chen, stay with me." She remembered using every bit of her training to help guide their wounded bird to something resembling a controlled crash. She remembered the impact, the way her body had slammed against the restraints, the way the instrument panel had exploded inward, sending shrapnel and fire into the cockpit. She remembered pulling herself from the wreckage, her flight suit on fire, her arm a mass of agony. She remembered dragging Marcus out, screaming for help, trying desperately to stop the bleeding from the wound in his chest. She didn't remember much after that, just fragments. The concerned face of a SEAL medic. The thunderous sound of the extraction helicopter overhead. The surreal calm of the medevac, looking up at an F4 bag swaying with the aircraft's movement. And then Walter Reed, and surgery after surgery, and the slow, agonizing process of learning that Marcus hadn't made it, that she'd survived but he hadn't, and trying to understand how that was fair, how that was right. A knock at her door pulled Sarah from her memories. She wiped at her eyes, when had she started crying, and called out, "Just a minute." Sarah opened the door to find her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patricia Morrison who lived in the apartment across the hall. Mrs. Morrison was holding a covered dish and wearing her usual warm smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made her entire face light up. "I hope I'm not interrupting, dear," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice carrying that gentle southern lilt she'd brought with her from Georgia 50 years ago. "I made too much chicken casserole again, and I thought you might like some. Lord knows I can't eat all of it myself." Sarah managed a smile, grateful for the distraction from her spiraling thoughts. "That's really kind of you, Mrs. Morrison. You didn't have to do that." "Nonsense," the older woman said, pressing the dish into Sarah's hands. "A young woman needs proper nutrition, especially one who's studying as hard as you do. I hear you up at all hours, typing away on that computer of yours." Sarah accepted the casserole, its warmth seeping through the dish towel wrapped around it. "I'm sorry if I've been too loud. I know the walls are thin." "Oh, hush now," Mrs. Morrison waved her hand dismissively. "I'm not complaining. It's actually comforting, knowing someone else is awake. Reminds me of when my son was in college. He was a night owl too." Her expression softened with memory. "He's a doctor now, out in Seattle. Doesn't visit as much as I'd like, but that's the way of things, isn't it? Sarah nodded, shifting the casserole to one arm. There was something about Mrs. Morrison's presence that was deeply soothing, a maternal warmth that Sarah hadn't realized she'd been missing until this moment. Actually, Mrs. Morrison said, her eyes twinkling with something that looked like mischief, I may have had an ulterior motive for coming over. I saw you on the TikTok. Sarah's stomach dropped. You're on TikTok? My grandson set it up for me, Mrs. Morrison said proudly. He says it keeps me young to know what the kids are up to these days. Though I must say, half of what I see on there makes no sense whatsoever. But that video of you at the coffee shop, now that made perfect sense. Sarah stepped back, gesturing for Mrs. Morrison to come inside. The older woman settled herself in the small armchair by the window, the one Sarah had picked up from a thrift store when she'd first moved in. Those boys should be ashamed of themselves, Mrs. Morrison continued, her voice taking on a steely edge that suggested she had strong opinions about proper behavior. Mocking someone's scars like that. In my day, their mothers would have tanned their hides for speaking to anyone that way, let alone a veteran. It's okay, Sarah said automatically, setting the casserole on her small kitchen counter. I handled it. Oh, I saw that you did, Mrs. Morrison said with evident approval. You handled it with more grace than they deserved, if you ask me. But that's not why I wanted to talk to you, dear. Sarah leaned against the counter, curious now. No? Mrs. Morrison's expression grew more serious, though no less kind. My late husband, God rest his soul, he was a pilot too. Navy. Flew missions in Vietnam. He came back with scars, though his weren't the kind you could see with your eyes. She paused, her gaze distant. He had nightmares for years. Couldn't talk about what he'd seen, what he'd done. It ate at him, keeping all that inside. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She knew exactly what Mrs. Morrison was talking about, the invisible wounds that often hurt worse than the physical ones. I watched him struggle for a long time, Mrs. Morrison continued, her voice gentle but firm. He thought he had to carry it all alone, that asking for help was weakness. It wasn't until he finally started going to the VA, started talking to other veterans, that he began to heal. Not completely, I don't think you ever heal completely from something like that, but enough to live, enough to find joy again. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah started, but the older woman held up her hand. I'm not trying to pry, dear. And I'm not saying you're struggling the same way Robert did. But I saw your face when you came home this evening, and I recognized that look. It's the look of someone who's carrying more than they should. Sarah blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I'm fine, she said, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. Fine is what we tell people when we don't want them to worry, Mrs. Morrison said wisely. But you don't have to be fine all the time, Sarah. You don't have to be strong every minute of every day. You served your country, you survived something terrible, and now you're trying to build a new life. That's more than enough. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were exactly what she needed to hear. She'd been so focused on being strong, on not letting the injury define her, on proving that she could still be successful and independent and whole, that she'd forgotten it was okay to struggle sometimes. It was okay to not be okay. I have a casserole to return to my apartment, Mrs. Morrison said, standing with the kind of deliberate grace that spoke to aching joints and careful movement. But my door is always open if you need to talk. Or if you just need to sit quietly with someone who understands. Sometimes that's just as important. Sarah crossed the room and, surprising herself, pulled the older woman into a gentle hug. Thank you, she whispered. Really? Thank you. Mrs. Morrison patted her back with soft, wrinkled hands. You're going to be just fine, dear. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And until then, you've got people who care about you, even if we're just your nosy neighbors. After Mrs. Morrison left, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table with a plate of casserole she wasn't entirely sure she could eat. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications. The video had climbed to over 200,000 views now, and people were sharing it across multiple platforms. Her story was spreading far beyond that single Starbucks, reaching people she'd never meet, sparking conversations she'd never hear. Part of her wanted to ask whoever posted it to take it down, to reclaim her privacy, to stop being a symbol and just be Sarah again. But another part of her, the part that had spoken up in that coffee shop, that had rolled up her sleeve and refused to be ashamed, understood that maybe this was important. Maybe some good could come from it. The next morning, Sarah woke to find her phone completely overwhelmed with notifications. The video had gone fully viral overnight, over 3 million views and climbing. Major news outlets were picking up the story. Her university email inbox contained dozens of interview requests from journalists, podcasters, and even a few television producers. But it was the other emails that caught her attention, the personal ones, from strangers who'd been moved by the video. Sarah found herself reading through them as she sat in bed, her coffee growing cold on the nightstand. One was from a woman named Jennifer in Ohio. "I've been hiding my mastectomy scars for 5 years, wearing high-necked shirts even in summer, terrified of what people might say. Watching you stand up to those boys made me realize I've been giving other people's potential cruelty too much power over my life. Thank you for your courage." Another from a man named David in Texas. "I'm a firefighter who was burned in a building collapse. I've been dreading going back to work, afraid of how people will react to my scars. Your video reminded me that these marks are evidence of survival, not something to be ashamed of. Thank you for your service, and for your strength." There were dozens more, from burn survivors, from veterans, from people with visible differences who'd spent years hiding, apologizing for their own bodies, making themselves smaller to accommodate other people's discomfort. Sarah set her phone down, overwhelmed by the weight of these confessions, these moments of vulnerability from complete strangers. She hadn't intended to become some kind of spokesperson for scar acceptance or visible difference advocacy. She'd just been trying to get coffee, trying to live her life, trying to exist in a world that sometimes seemed determined to make that existence as difficult as possible. Her phone rang, and she saw it was her mother calling from Sacramento. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. Her relationship with her parents had been complicated since the accident. They loved her fiercely, but they also struggled with what had happened to her, with the military career they'd never fully supported, with the daughter who'd come home broken and had to be rebuilt. "Hi, Mom," Sarah answered, trying to inject cheerfulness into her voice. "Sarah, honey, are you okay?" her mother asked immediately, her voice tight with worry. "Your aunt sent me this video, and, oh sweetheart, I had no idea people were treating you that way." "I'm fine, Mom." "Really? It was just a few stupid guys." "It's not fine," her mother interrupted, and Sarah could hear the tears in her voice. "My baby girl served her country, nearly died for it, and these boys think they can mock you? Make fun of your scars?" Sarah leaned back against her headboard, closing her eyes. "Mom, please don't cry. It's handled. I stood up for myself, and they apologized. It's over." "But it's not over, is it?" her mother said, and her voice had shifted into that particular tone she used when she was trying to be understanding but was really just afraid. "This video is everywhere, Sarah. Everyone's talking about it. What if this affects your future? What if employers see this? What if they see that I'm someone who stands up for herself?" Sarah interrupted gently. "What if they see that I'm a veteran who's proud of her service? Mom, I can't control how people react to me. I can only control how I react to them." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then her mother's voice came back, quieter now. "When did you become so strong, baby? When did you stop needing me to protect you?" Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. "I still need you, Mom. I'll always need you. But I also need to be able to stand on my own, you know? I survived that crash, survived the surgeries, survived months of rehab. I can survive a few jerks in a coffee shop." "I know," her mother whispered. "I know you can. I wish none of this had happened to you. I wish you'd chosen a different path, a safer path." "But I didn't," Sarah said softly. And I can't change that, and honestly, I wouldn't want to. What happened to me was terrible, and I lost someone important to me, and I'll carry these scars for the rest of my life. But I also did something that mattered, Mom. I helped people. I saved lives. That has to count for something. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. It counts for everything, sweetheart. I'm sorry if I've ever made you feel like I wasn't proud of you. I am. So proud. I'm just scared too. I know, Sarah said. I'm scared sometimes too. But we're both going to be okay. After the call ended, Sarah sat with her phone in her lap, staring at the blank screen. She thought about all the people who'd reached out, all the strangers who'd shared their own stories of survival and scarring and learning to exist in a world that often had very narrow definitions of what bodies should look like. She thought about Marcus Rodriguez, about the way he'd always encouraged her to speak up, to take up space, to never apologize for who she was. You earned your place in this cockpit, he'd told her once, after she'd apologized for some minor mistake during a training flight. Stop saying sorry for existing. Marcus would have loved the irony of her becoming an accidental advocate, she thought. He'd always said she had a voice worth hearing, even when she doubted it herself. Sarah opened her laptop and started typing an email to one of the journalists who'd reached out, a reporter from a military publication who'd specifically asked about the experience of female combat pilots, about injury and recovery, about rebuilding identity after service. Maybe it was time to stop running from her story. Maybe it was time to own it, to use it, to turn something painful into something purposeful. The interview with the military publication led to other opportunities. Within a week, Sarah found herself being asked to speak at a veterans event on campus, to share her story with other student veterans who were navigating the complicated transition from military to civilian life, from service member to student. She almost said no. Public speaking had never been her strength. She was more comfortable in a cockpit, where the communication was clear and technical, where emotions were secondary to mission success. But something about the request resonated with her. How many times had she felt alone in this transition? How many times had she wished for someone who understood, who could tell her that the disorientation and grief and struggle to redefine herself were normal? The event was held in one of the university's older lecture halls, the kind with wooden seats that creaked and tall windows that let in the afternoon light and dusty golden shafts. Sarah arrived early, her stomach churning with nerves, and found about 40 people already gathered, veterans from conflicts spanning decades, from Vietnam to the recent withdrawals from the Middle East. She recognized the body language immediately, the careful way people held themselves, the scanning eyes that never fully settled, the unconscious habit of noting exits and sitting with backs to walls. These were her people, even if she'd never met them before. An older veteran approached her, a woman in her 60s with silver hair cut short and sharp blue eyes that had seen their share of trouble. "You're Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Colonel Janet Whitmore, retired. Army Intelligence. I saw your video." Sarah shook her hand, noting the firm grip, the confidence in the woman's bearing. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am." "None of that ma'am business now that I'm retired," Colonel Whitmore said with a slight smile. "Call me Janet. I wanted to thank you, actually. What you did in that coffee shop, standing up for yourself like that, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "That our scars, visible or invisible, don't diminish us. They're evidence of service, of sacrifice, of survival. For too long, I've been hiding my own struggles with PTSD, afraid it would make me seem weak. But watching you refuse to be ashamed of your scars made me realize I've been doing myself a disservice." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "I wasn't trying to be brave. I was just tired of hiding." "That's exactly what brave is," Janet said quietly. "Being tired of the alternative." The event coordinator, a young veteran named Marcus, Sarah tried not to flinch at the name, called everyone to their seats. Sarah found herself at a table at the front of the room, alongside two other speakers, a Marine who'd lost both legs in an IED explosion and a Navy corpsman who'd served multiple tours treating wounded warriors in field hospitals. As Sarah waited for her turn to speak, she listened to their stories. The Marine, a man named James, spoke about the challenge of redefining athleticism and capability in a body that no longer worked the way it once had. The corpsman, a woman named Dr. Alicia Torres, talked about the weight of carrying other people's trauma, of trying to save everyone and learning to live with the ones you couldn't save. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood, her legs feeling slightly unsteady, and looked out at the sea of faces. Fellow veterans, people who understood in ways that civilians never quite could. She could see her own experience reflected in their eyes, the loss, the adaptation, the ongoing struggle to find purpose and meaning in a world that often seemed to have moved on without them. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say here," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm not a motivational speaker. I'm just a former pilot trying to figure out how to be a college student, how to exist in a world where the biggest challenge is writing a term paper instead of flying through enemy fire." A few people laughed, recognizing the absurdity of the transition. 3 weeks ago, I would have hidden from what happened at that coffee shop. I would have put my head down, left quietly, and spent the rest of the day hating myself for not being normal enough, for carrying visible evidence of the worst night of my life on my skin. But something shifted in me that day. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe I finally realized that hiding wasn't protecting me, it was just making me smaller. Sarah rolled up her sleeve, revealing the scarring and the tattoo. These scars represent the night I lost my co-pilot and mentor. They represent 8 months in a hospital, learning to use my arm again. They represent the end of my flying career, the end of the identity I'd built for myself. For a long time, I saw them as marks of loss, of failure, of everything that had been taken from me. She paused, looking down at her arm. But they're also evidence that I survived. That I pulled myself and my co-pilot from a burning aircraft. That I endured surgery after surgery and never gave up. That I'm still here, still fighting, still trying to build a life worth living. Her voice grew stronger. A lot of you are carrying scars too, maybe visible like mine, maybe hidden where only you can feel them. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it gets easier, or that one day you'll wake up and everything will be fine. But I will tell you that you're not alone. That every person in this room understands, on some level, what it means to serve, to sacrifice, to survive. Sarah looked directly at the audience now, meeting eyes, acknowledging the shared experience. We're allowed to struggle. We're allowed to be angry at what we've lost, to grieve for the people we were before, to feel lost in this civilian world that sometimes seems designed for people who've never had to make the kinds of choices we've made. But we're also allowed to be proud of our service, to honor our scars, and to refuse to let other people's ignorance or cruelty define how we see ourselves. The room was completely silent, the kind of profound quiet that comes when truth has been spoken and recognized. So if you take nothing else from what I'm saying, take this: you are not your worst day. You are not your trauma. You are not defined by what was done to you or what you had to do in service. You're a whole person, complex and flawed and still becoming. And you deserve to take up space in this world without apology. The applause that followed Sarah's words was thunderous, echoing off the wooden walls of the lecture hall. But what struck her most wasn't the volume, it was the emotion behind it. People weren't just clapping politely, they were standing, some with tears streaming down their faces, others nodding with recognition and understanding. This wasn't just appreciation for a speech. This was acknowledgement of shared pain, shared survival, shared humanity. After the formal presentation ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by fellow veterans wanting to share their own stories, to make connections, to simply be seen by someone who understood. A young Army specialist told her about his struggle with traumatic brain injury and the invisible symptoms that made people think he was fine when he was falling apart inside. A former Air Force sergeant spoke about the challenge of being a woman in a male-dominated field and how she'd learned to take up space without apology. An older Vietnam veteran clasped her hand and simply said, "Welcome home, pilot. Welcome home." Those words, "welcome home," hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. She'd been back in the States for 2 years, but somehow, in this room full of people who'd worn the uniform, who'd answered the call, who'd paid prices that couldn't be calculated in simple terms, she felt more at home than she had anywhere else since the crash. Colonel Janet Whitmore, call me Janet, approached as the crowd began to thin. You have a gift for this, she said, her sharp blue eyes assessing Sarah with approval. For making people feel less alone. Have you considered doing more speaking engagements? Sarah laughed, surprised by the suggestion. I'm just trying to get through my undergraduate degree. Public speaking wasn't exactly on my radar. Sometimes the things we need most aren't on our radar, Janet replied. I run a nonprofit, Veterans Voices Forward. We work with transitioning service members, helping them find purpose after active duty. We could use someone like you, someone who can speak to the younger generation of veterans, especially the women and the wounded warriors. I don't know if I'm qualified. Qualified? Janet interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. You just stood in front of 40 skeptical, hurting veterans and made them feel understood. You shared your truth without sugarcoating it, without offering false hope, but also without descending into despair. That's exactly the kind of voice we need. Sarah hesitated, feeling the weight of the opportunity and the responsibility it carried. Can I think about it? Of course, Janet said, handing her a business card. But don't think too long. The world needs voices like yours, Sarah. Voices that tell the truth about service and sacrifice and survival. As Sarah left the lecture hall, her mind was spinning with possibilities she'd never considered. Maybe her path forward wasn't just about finishing school and finding some corporate job where she could disappear into anonymity. Maybe there was a way to take the worst experience of her life and transform it into something that could help others. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hi Sarah, this is Brandon, the guy from Starbucks. The one who was a complete jerk. I got your number from a mutual friend, hope that's okay. I wanted to reach out and apologize properly, not just because I got caught but because I've been thinking about what you said. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? I understand if not. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Part of her wanted to delete it, to leave that encounter in the past where it belonged. But another part of her, the part that had just spent an hour talking about growth and understanding and not being defined by worst moments, recognized an opportunity. She typed back, same Starbucks. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. But you're buying. The next afternoon, Sarah arrived at the Starbucks to find Brandon already there, looking significantly less confident than he had during their first encounter. He was sitting at a corner table, nervously tapping his fingers against his coffee cup, his backwards baseball cap replaced by a more subdued forward-facing one. He stood as she approached. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Sarah sat down across from him, accepting the vanilla latte he'd already ordered for her. I almost didn't. But I figured if I'm going to talk about growth and second chances, I should probably be willing to offer them. Brandon winced. I deserve that. Look, I've spent the past week feeling like absolute garbage about what I said to you. My uncle, the Marine I mentioned, he saw the video. He called me and tore me apart, and rightfully so. But more than that, I've been doing a lot of thinking about why I acted that way. And? Sarah prompted, curious despite herself. I think I was uncomfortable, Brandon admitted, his voice quiet. Seeing your scars, seeing evidence of real suffering and sacrifice, it made me confront how shallow and privileged my life has been. And instead of sitting with that discomfort, instead of using it as a moment to learn something, I mocked you. I tried to make you small so I could feel big again. Sarah took a sip of her latte, considering his words. That's a pretty profound realization for someone who was making wood chipper jokes a week ago. Yeah, well, my uncle can be pretty profound when he's furious, Brandon said with a sad smile. He told me that mocking someone's scars is like spitting on their survival. That every scar tells a story of a moment when someone could have died but didn't, and that deserves respect, not ridicule. Your uncle sounds wise. He is. He also told me that if I ever acted like that again, he'd personally make sure I understood what real hardship looked like. Brandon paused, then met Sarah's eyes directly. But beyond being scared of my uncle's wrath, I genuinely want to do better. I want to be better. I'm just not sure how. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him. She could see genuine remorse in his expression, real shame over his behavior. But she'd also learned that remorse without action was just another form of self-indulgence. Here's the thing, Brandon, she said finally. Apologizing to me is a good first step, but it's just that, a first step. The real question is what you do next time you encounter someone who makes you uncomfortable, someone whose body or appearance or identity challenges your worldview. Do you revert to mockery and cruelty, or do you choose curiosity and compassion? Brandon nodded slowly, absorbing her words. You're right. I know you're right. But how do I make sure I choose differently next time? How do I change patterns I didn't even realize I had? Sarah considered the question. A week ago, she might have told him that wasn't her problem to solve, that he needed to figure out his own growth. But the past week had taught her something about the power of guidance, of sharing wisdom earned through suffering. Start by examining your assumptions, she said. When you see someone who looks different, when you encounter someone whose body tells a story you don't understand, pause. Ask yourself why you're reacting the way you are. Are you uncomfortable? Scared? Curious? And then choose how to respond based on your values, not your immediate emotional reaction. That makes sense, Brandon said, pulling out his phone. Do you mind if I write this down? Sarah nodded, and he began typing notes as she continued. Second, educate yourself. Learn about the experiences of veterans, of people with visible differences, of anyone whose life experience differs dramatically from your own. Read their stories, listen to their voices. Let them teach you about resilience and survival and the many different ways human beings navigate this world. Brandon looked up from his phone. Do you have any recommendations? Books or documentaries or anything? Sarah thought for a moment. There's a documentary called The Invisible War about military sexual trauma. Restrepo and Karengal about combat experiences. For books, try What It Is Like to Go to War by Carl Morlantes, or The Evil Hours by David Morris about PTSD. But also, and this is important, seek out voices that aren't just about trauma. Find veterans and disabled folks who are living full, complex lives. We're not just our worst experiences. Got it, Brandon said, still typing. Then he looked up, his expression earnest. Can I ask you something? And you can totally tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead. How do you do it? How do you exist in the world with those scars, knowing that some people are going to react badly? Knowing that you'll face judgment and mockery and invasive questions? How do you not let that crush you? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. It was something she'd been grappling with herself, something she was still learning. Honestly? Some days are harder than others, she admitted. Some days I want to hide, to cover every inch of scarred skin, to pretend I'm someone I'm not. But I've learned that hiding doesn't protect me, it just makes me smaller. And I didn't survive that crash, I didn't endure months of rehabilitation, I didn't rebuild my entire life, just to make myself smaller for other people's comfort. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the tattoo and scars once again. These marks are part of my story. They represent pain, yes, but they also represent survival, courage, service. They're evidence that I've lived through something extraordinary, that I've been tested in ways most people never will be. Why should I hide that? Brandon stared at her arm, but this time his expression held only respect. I wish I'd understood that before. I wish I'd seen you as a person with a story instead of just, I don't know, a spectacle. Most people don't understand until they're forced to, Sarah said, rolling her sleeve back down. And that's partly a failure of our culture, of how we talk about bodies and difference and disability. We treat anyone who doesn't fit a narrow definition of normal as either tragic or inspirational, never just as human beings living complex lives. Inspirational? Brandon asked, looking confused. You'd be surprised how many people see my scars and immediately start talking about how inspiring I am, how I'm so brave just for existing in public. They mean well, but it's another form of othering. I'm not inspirational for getting coffee. I'm just a person who wants coffee. Brandon laughed, but it was a thoughtful sound. I never thought about it that way. I guess I always thought calling someone inspirational was a compliment. It can be, Sarah acknowledged. When it's about genuine achievements or actions. But when it's just about existing with a disability or visible difference, it reduces people to objects of inspiration for non-disabled folks. It's called inspiration porn, actually, using images of disabled people to make non-disabled people feel better about their own lives. That's, wow. I have a lot to learn. We all do, Sarah said. I'm still learning too. Learning how to navigate the world in this body, learning how to balance self-protection with openness, learning how to honor my past while building my future. Brandon was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can I ask what you're studying?" "At UCLA? Political science," Sarah replied. "I'm interested in Veterans Affairs policy, in how we can better support service members transitioning to civilian life. There are so many gaps in the system, so many ways we fail the people who've served." "That makes sense," Brandon said. "Using your experience to help others." "Maybe," Sarah said. "Or maybe I'm just trying to make meaning out of something senseless. My co-pilot died that night. Marcus Rodriguez, he was a good man, a great pilot, a mentor. He had a wife and 2 kids. And he died while I survived, and I still don't understand why. But if I can use what I learned from that experience, from losing him, to help other veterans, maybe his death means something. Maybe it's not just a waste." Her voice had grown thick with emotion, and she was surprised to find tears pricking at her eyes. She'd talked about Marcus before, in therapy, with other veterans, but something about this moment, sitting across from someone who'd hurt her and was genuinely trying to change, made the grief feel fresh again. Brandon reached across the table, not quite touching her hand but close enough to be a gesture of comfort. "I'm sorry for your loss. And I'm sorry I made you relive any of this with my stupidity last week." Sarah wiped at her eyes, managing a small smile. "You know what? I think I needed to relive it. I've been so focused on moving forward, on not dwelling on the past, that I forgot it's okay to still grieve. It's okay to still miss him. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting." The conversation with Brandon continued for another hour, ranging from serious discussions about military service and disability to lighter topics about college life and the challenges of figuring out who you want to be as an adult. By the time they parted ways, Sarah felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness, exactly, but a sense of possibility. People could change. Growth was possible. Even someone who'd started from a place of cruelty could choose to be better. As she walked back to her apartment, Sarah's phone rang. It was Janet Whitmore. "Sarah, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," Janet's crisp voice came through. "But I wanted to follow up on our conversation. We have an opportunity that I think would be perfect for you." "What kind of opportunity?" Sarah asked, pausing on the sidewalk. "There's a National Veterans Conference in San Diego next month. We need a speaker for the panel on wounded warriors and transition challenges. The audience would be about 300 people, veterans, mental health professionals, policymakers. Your story, your perspective, could make a real impact." Sarah's heart rate picked up. 300 people was significantly more than the 40 she'd spoken to at the university event. "Janet, I don't know if I'm ready for something that big." You stood in front of a coffee shop full of strangers and turned a moment of cruelty into a teaching moment, Janet interrupted gently. You spoke to a room of skeptical veterans and made them feel less alone. And from what I've been hearing, that video of you has sparked conversations about visible injuries in military service all over the country. You're already making an impact, Sarah. This would just be a bigger platform. Sarah thought about the emails she'd received, the messages from strangers who'd found courage in her refusal to hide. She thought about Marcus, about how he always encouraged her to use her voice. She thought about all the veterans who were struggling in silence, who felt alone in their pain. Okay, she said, surprising herself. "I'll do it." "Excellent," Janet said, and Sarah could hear the smile in her voice. "I'll send you the details." "And Sarah?" "Thank you. This matters more than you know." After hanging up, Sarah continued walking, her mind already spinning with what she might say to an audience of 300. But as she turned the corner onto her street, she noticed a commotion outside her apartment building. A small news van was parked at the curb, and a reporter with a cameraman was interviewing someone. It was Mrs. Morrison. Sarah approached cautiously, and Mrs. Morrison's face lit up when she saw her. "Oh, here she is now." "Sarah, dear, this nice reporter wanted to talk about your video." The reporter, a polished woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and an eager expression, turned to Sarah. "Miss Chen, I'm Rebecca Walsh from KTLA. I'd love to get your perspective on how the video has impacted the national conversation about veterans and visible injuries. Do you have a few minutes?" Sarah glanced at Mrs. Morrison, who gave her an encouraging nod, then back at the reporter. She thought about declining, about escaping to the privacy of her apartment. But then she remembered what she'd just committed to, speaking at a conference, using her platform to help other veterans. "Sure," Sarah said. "But can we do this inside? I'd rather not have the whole neighborhood watching." They settled in Mrs. Morrison's apartment, which was larger and better furnished than Sarah's, and the cameraman set up while the reporter reviewed her notes. Mrs. Morrison bustled around making tea, clearly delighted to be hosting such an event. "So, Sarah," Rebecca began once the camera was rolling, "your video has been viewed over 10 million times now. People across the country are talking about disability visibility, about how we treat veterans, about the casual cruelty that people with visible differences face. Did you ever imagine that standing up to those young men would spark this kind of conversation?" Sarah shook her head. "Honestly, no. I was just trying to get coffee. I was tired of hiding, tired of making myself small to accommodate other people's discomfort. I didn't set out to start a movement or become a spokesperson. I just wanted to exist without apologizing for it." "But you've become a voice for many people who felt silenced," Rebecca pressed. "The disability community, the veteran community, they're rallying around your message. How does that feel?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "It's overwhelming, if I'm honest. A week ago, I was just a student trying to figure out how to navigate college with a disability. Now I'm getting emails from people all over the world, sharing their stories of surviving burns, accidents, combat injuries. The weight of that responsibility, of being someone they're looking to for guidance, it's a lot." "But you're handling it," Rebecca observed. "I'm trying to," Sarah said. "With help. I have people like Mrs. Morrison here, who remind me to be human, to take care of myself. I have fellow veterans who understand the unique challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. And I have a community that's emerging around this idea that our scars, visible or invisible, are part of our stories, not things to be ashamed of." Rebecca leaned forward. "There's been some backlash, too. People saying you were too harsh on those young men, that you were looking for a confrontation, that you're using your military service for attention. How do you respond to that?" Sarah felt a flash of anger but kept her voice level. "I'd say that's exactly the kind of victim blaming that keeps people silent about discrimination. I didn't ask to be mocked in a coffee shop. I didn't create that confrontation, I responded to it. And as for using my military service for attention, I earned these scars serving my country. I watched my co-pilot die. I survived months of painful rehabilitation. If sharing that experience helps even one person feel less alone, then I'll keep sharing it, regardless of what critics say." Mrs. Morrison, who'd been quietly listening from her chair by the window, spoke up. "That's exactly right, dear. You've got nothing to apologize for." Rebecca smiled. "One final question, Sarah. What do you hope people take away from your story?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I hope people understand that everyone they encounter is carrying something, visible or invisible. That body diversity is real and valid, that scars and disabilities and differences don't diminish someone's humanity or worth. And I hope that the next time someone sees a person who looks different from them, instead of staring or mocking or making assumptions, they'll choose compassion. They'll choose to see a whole person with a complex story, not just a spectacle to gawk at or judge. She paused, then added, and for the people who are carrying scars, physical or emotional, I hope they know they're not alone. That survival is something to be proud of, not ashamed of. That they have every right to exist in this world without apology, without making themselves smaller for anyone else's comfort. The interview aired that evening, and by the next morning, Sarah's story had reached an even wider audience. But something had shifted in how she processed the attention. Instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable, she felt a growing sense of purpose. Each email from a survivor, each message from a veteran finding courage in her words, reinforced that her pain could have meaning beyond just her own experience. The month leading up to the San Diego conference passed in a blur. Sarah balanced her coursework with interview requests, speaking to college classes about veteran experiences, and working with Janet's organization to develop programs for transitioning service members. She also maintained her unlikely friendship with Brandon, who'd become genuinely committed to educating himself and even started volunteering at a local VA hospital. My uncle couldn't believe it when I told him, Brandon had said during one of their coffee meetings. They'd started meeting weekly, always at the same Starbucks where it had all begun. He said maybe there's hope for my generation after all. The barista with purple streaks in her hair, Sarah had learned her name was Maya, always gave them a knowing smile when they came in together. The coffee shop had become something of a symbol for Sarah, a place where she'd refused to hide, where she'd chosen dignity over silence, where change had begun. On the morning of the conference, Sarah stood in her hotel room in San Diego, staring at herself in the mirror. She'd chosen to wear a sleeveless dress, something she never would have considered 6 months ago. Her scars were fully visible, the tattoo prominent on her forearm. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old anxiety, the urge to cover up, to hide, to protect herself from potential judgment. Then she thought about all the people who'd reached out to her, who'd found strength in her visibility. She thought about the young veteran she'd spoken to last week who'd finally stopped wearing long sleeves in summer. She thought about the burn survivor who'd sent her a photo of herself at the beach for the first time in years. She thought about Marcus, about how he believed in her even when she hadn't believed in herself. Sarah rolled her shoulders back and lifted her chin. She was ready. The conference hall was massive, filled with 300 people just as Janet had promised. Veterans of all ages, military families, healthcare providers, policymakers, all gathered to discuss the challenges of wounded warriors transitioning to civilian life. Sarah stood backstage, listening to the other panelists speak, each one sharing their own journey of injury, recovery, and rebuilding. Then it was her turn. She walked onto the stage, and the audience fell silent. She could feel their eyes on her scars, on her tattoo, on the physical evidence of her story written across her skin. But this time, instead of shrinking from the attention, she embraced it. "My name is Sarah Chen," she began, her voice steady and clear. 2 years ago, I was Chief Warrant Officer Chen, a Black Hawk pilot with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Today, I'm a college student with visible scars and an invisible grief that I carry every single day. Both of these identities are true. Both of these versions of me are real. And I've learned that I don't have to choose between them, I can be all of it, all at once. She spoke for 20 minutes, sharing not just the story of the crash and her recovery, but the smaller, harder truths of daily life with visible injuries. The way strangers felt entitled to her story. The challenge of dating when your body told a story before you could. The grief of losing not just a co-pilot but an entire identity, an entire future you'd imagined for yourself. But here's what I've also learned, Sarah continued, her eyes scanning the audience. Our scars, visible or invisible, don't define us, but they do refine us. They teach us about resilience, about the human capacity to endure and adapt. They connect us to others who've survived their own battles. And when we choose to be visible, when we refuse to hide our stories, we give permission to others to do the same. She saw people nodding, saw tears on some faces, saw the recognition of shared experience rippling through the crowd. A month ago, 3 college students mocked my scars in a coffee shop. They made jokes about wood chippers and lawn mowers, turned my survival into their entertainment. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could shrink away, let their cruelty silence me, or I could stand tall and refuse to apologize for existing in a body that's been through trauma. Sarah paused, letting the weight of those words settle. I chose visibility. I chose dignity. And that choice has led me here, to this stage, to this community of survivors and warriors and healers. Because when we share our stories, when we refuse to let shame or fear dictate how we move through the world, we create space for others to do the same. She concluded with words that came straight from her heart. To every veteran in this room, to every person carrying scars that others can't see or don't understand, you are not broken. You are not less than. You are warriors who've survived battles that would have destroyed others. You've earned every scar, every sleepless night, every moment of struggle. And you deserve to exist in this world without apology, without shame, without making yourself smaller for anyone's comfort. Stand tall. Be visible. Tell your story. Because the world needs voices like ours, voices that speak truth about service and sacrifice and the complicated, beautiful work of survival. The applause was deafening. People rose to their feet, and Sarah saw veterans saluting, saw tears streaming down faces, saw the kind of recognition that only comes when truth has been spoken and received by those who need it most. As Sarah left the stage, Janet Whitmore met her with a fierce hug. "You did it," she whispered. "You gave them hope." But Sarah knew it was more than that. She hadn't just given them hope, she'd given them permission. Permission to be visible, to be proud, to carry their scars as evidence of survival rather than marks of shame. Later that evening, Sarah sat on the balcony of her hotel room, watching the sun set over San Diego Bay. Her phone was full of messages, from people in the audience, from veterans who'd watched the live stream, from strangers who'd been moved by her words. But one message stood out. It was from Brandon. "Watched your speech online. You were right, choosing compassion over cruelty changes everything. Thank you for teaching me that. My uncle watched too. He says you'd have made a hell of a Marine." Sarah smiled, then opened her email to compose a message to Janet. She was ready to do more speaking, more advocacy, more work to support veterans in transition. But she was also ready to keep being a student, to keep building friendships, to keep learning who Sarah Chen was when she wasn't defined by any single role or identity. She thought about Marcus, about how he'd told her she had a voice worth hearing. He'd been right, even if it had taken her this long to believe it. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Sarah stood, feeling the evening breeze on her scarred arms, and smiled. She'd survived a crash that should have killed her. She'd endured months of agonizing recovery. She'd rebuilt herself piece by piece, scar by scar. And now, she was finally learning to thrive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.